History remembers emperors as mighty conquerors, ruthless tyrants, or divine rulers. But what if I told you that one of Rome's most infamous emperors, Nero, didn't die in a blaze of glory, nor on the battlefield, nor even in front of his enemies? Instead, his death was so humiliating, so pathetic, that even his loyal servants turned away in disgust. This is not the death of a hero, nor the fall of a villain. It's something far more tragic and far more bizarre. Stay with me, because once you hear how the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty really met his end, you'll never think of Roman history the same way again. Nero Claudius Caesar, remembered by history as one of the most infamous emperors of Rome, was a man whose reign was painted with excess, cruelty, and scandal. To understand how his death became one of the most pathetic and humiliating ends in the history of emperors, one must first understand who Nero was and how he rose to such extraordinary heights of power. His story does not begin with weakness or disgrace, but with privilege, ambition, and a dynasty that had already shaped Rome into a mighty empire. Nero was born on December 15, 37 AD, into the powerful Julio-Claudian dynasty. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was of noble lineage, but it was through his mother, Agrippina the Younger, that his destiny was sealed. Agrippina was the sister of Emperor Caligula and the great-granddaughter of Augustus, Rome's first emperor. From the moment Nero was born, he carried imperial blood in his veins, and Agrippina was determined to make her son emperor no matter the cost. Agrippina was ambitious, ruthless, and shrewd in her politics. She knew Rome was not a place where weakness could survive. To secure her son's path to the throne, she married her uncle, the Emperor Claudius. In 49 AD, Claudius, an older man who had been considered weak and clumsy by much of Rome, had nonetheless survived and risen to power after the assassination of Caligula. By marrying him, Agrippina tied Nero directly to the imperial family, ensuring his claim would be stronger than any rival. She did not stop there. Agrippina persuaded Claudius to adopt Nero as his son, placing him ahead of Claudius's biological son Britannicus in the line of succession. From that moment, Nero's rise was secured, and Agrippina began to shape him into Rome's next ruler. When Claudius died suddenly in 54 AD, rumors spread quickly that Agrippina herself had poisoned him with a dish of mushrooms. Whether true or not, the effect was undeniable. Nero, at the tender age of 16, was proclaimed Emperor of Rome. At first, the young emperor was not the tyrant that later accounts would describe. Under the guidance of his mother, his tutor, Seneca, the philosopher, and the prefect, Burrus, Nero's rule seemed promising. Rome enjoyed relative stability, and the empire's administration was competently managed by those around him. For a brief moment, the idea that Nero could grow into a capable and wise ruler seemed possible. He was young, charismatic, and handsome, adored by the Roman people, who always loved a youthful emperor with charm. But beneath this early promise lay a personality ill-suited to the demands of leadership. Nero was more interested in the arts than in governance. He fancied himself a poet, an actor, a charioteer, and above all, a musician. He longed for applause on the stage, not in the Senate. His nights were spent in lavish feasts, debauchery, and performances, while the burdens of state fell increasingly to others. Agrippina, ever watchful and determined to retain influence, tried to keep her son under control. But Nero resented her interference. Their relationship, once close, grew tense and dangerous. By the time he was in his early 20s, Nero had grown tired of his mother's dominance, and in a move that shocked Rome, he orchestrated her murder. The death of Agrippina in 59 AD marked a turning point in Nero's reign. It symbolized the beginning of his descent into tyranny. With his mother gone, Nero was free of the one person who might have guided or restrained him. He became increasingly reckless and paranoid, indulging his passions while crushing opposition with cruelty. Those who whispered against him found themselves exiled, imprisoned, or executed. His own wife, Octavia, the daughter of Claudius, was divorced and later killed under false charges. Those who had once supported him, like Seneca, were forced to take their own lives. As Nero tightened his grip on Rome, the people began to see him not as the charming young emperor they once adored, but as a madman obsessed with his own pleasures. His performances as a singer and actor scandalized Rome's elite, who considered such behavior beneath the dignity of an emperor. Yet Nero craved the adoration of the crowds, forcing senators and nobles to attend his plays and applaud. He raced in chariots, sang in contests, and believed himself destined to be remembered as a great artist rather than a great ruler. Then, in 64 AD, disaster struck. A great fire broke out in Rome, consuming much of the city. The fire raged for days, destroying temples, homes, and entire districts. People were left homeless, terrified, and furious. Rumors spread that Nero himself had ordered the fire, either to clear land for his grand building projects or simply to watch Rome burn. The infamous story of Nero fiddling while Rome burned comes from this event. though historians debate whether he was truly playing music during the disaster. What mattered was perception. The people believed he was indifferent, even delighted by their suffering. To divert blame, Nero accused the Christians, a small and despised sect at the time, of starting the fire. The persecution that followed was brutal, with Christians burned alive, crucified, or torn apart by animals in the arena. But the fire left more than death in its wake. It exposed Nero's extravagance. Instead of helping the victims, he built his massive golden house, the Domus Aurea, a sprawling palace with artificial lakes, gilded halls, and gardens fit for a god. Too many Romans, this was proof that Nero cared only for himself, and resentment simmered. The senators despised him, the army began to lose faith, and the people who had once cheered him now cursed his name. By the late 60s AD, rebellion was in the air. In the provinces, governors began to rise against him. In Gaul, Spain, and Africa, the seeds of revolt were planted. In 68 AD, the governor of Gaul, Vindex, openly declared against Nero, though his revolt was crushed. Yet the rebellion inspired others. In Spain, Galba, another governor, declared himself emperor, and soon the Praetorian Guard in Rome. The very soldiers sworn to protect Nero abandoned him. Alone, despised, and without allies, Nero's grip on power collapsed. The Senate, sensing the end, declared him a public enemy. To be condemned by the Senate was the ultimate disgrace. It meant he was no longer emperor, but a criminal, stripped of honor, and hunted like any common man. Nero, once the ruler of the greatest empire on earth, found himself utterly alone. Those who had once bowed to him now sought his death. He fled Rome with only a few loyal freedmen, terrified and broken. The final hours of Nero's life are among the most pathetic in history. He hid in the villa of a minor supporter outside the city, trembling with fear as news reached him that soldiers were closing in. He begged for someone, anyone, to kill him, but none would. He could not face the humiliation of capture, knowing he would be paraded through the streets before being executed in the most degrading way. At last, as the hoofbeats of the soldiers grew louder, Nero forced himself to act. With the help of his secretary, Epaphroditus, he drove a dagger into his throat. His final words, as recorded by historians, were chilling. "What an artist dies in me." Thus ended the reign of Nero, not with grandeur or dignity, but with cowardice and shame. The once powerful emperor, who had commanded armies and ruled over millions, died like a frightened fugitive. His death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, plunging Rome into chaos and civil war. And yet, despite his cruelty and madness, some in Rome mourned him. The common people, who had once enjoyed his games and spectacles, left flowers at his grave. Legend spread that Nero had not truly died, that he would return. A belief so persistent it became known as the Nero Redivivus myth. The story of Nero's death is not just about the fall of a man, but about the fragility of power. He had everything: youth, wealth, lineage, and empire, yet in the end, he died not as a mighty emperor but as a coward begging for death. His downfall remains a lesson for all time, a reminder that tyranny, arrogance, and excess inevitably lead to ruin. The murder of Agrippina was a crime that shocked even Rome, a city long accustomed to blood and betrayal. It was not just the death of a woman, but the slaying of a mother by her son, a violation of one of the most sacred Roman values, the duty owed to family and gods. Nero had justified the act by spreading lies that his mother had plotted against him, but few truly believed it. The whispers in the streets spoke of an emperor who had become a monster. Yet for Nero, death was liberation. No longer restrained by her influence, he was free to indulge every desire without fear of reproach. This was the moment his reign shifted from uneasy stability into a descent of madness. Cruelty and excess. At first, he tried to bury his guilt in pleasures. He surrounded himself with sycophants, who praised his every word and every performance. He spent more time with musicians, poets, and actors than with generals or senators. Nero wanted to be admired not as a ruler but as an artist. He believed his voice was a gift to the world, his songs divine, his acting unmatched. To the senators who had to sit through endless performances, forced to clap until their hands ached, it was humiliation. But to the people, especially the lower classes, who loved spectacle, Nero's shows were a source of amusement. He raced chariots like a commoner in the circus. He played the lyre on stage. He sang epic verses. And he demanded the kind of applause given to heroes. The line between emperor and entertainer blurred, and many wondered if Rome was ruled by a sovereign or a clown. But beneath the laughter and music lay an undercurrent of fear. Those who did not applaud loudly enough were watched. Those who whispered mockery risked their lives. Nero's paranoia grew steadily, as though killing his mother had opened a door to endless suspicion. His wife, Octavia, beloved by the Roman people, was accused of infertility and later of treason. She was exiled and then executed. Her death, ordered by Nero's new lover, Poppaea Sabina, a woman of beauty and cunning who knew how to manipulate the emperor's desires. Poppaea herself became empress, adored by Nero, yet even she was not safe from his violence. One story tells that in a fit of rage, he kicked her in the stomach while she was pregnant, killing both her and the unborn child. Whether exaggerated or not, the story captured how far Nero's cruelty had descended to an emperor who murdered his own wife and child in blind anger. As the personal tragedies piled, Nero sought distraction in grand projects. He built lavish palaces and monuments, spending vast sums of Rome's treasury to create wonders that reflected his ego. Yet nothing would tarnish his reputation more than the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. The fire raged for 6 days, consuming the heart of the city. Ancient temples, crowded markets, and countless homes were reduced to ashes. Thousands were left destitute. As the flames spread, rumors ignited faster than the fire itself. Many swore they saw men throwing torches into houses, acting on imperial orders. Others claimed that Nero watched the inferno from his palace, playing his lyre and singing of the fall of Troy, as if Rome's suffering was his stage. The truth may never be fully known. Some sources suggest Nero was not even in Rome when the fire began, and when he returned, he opened his gardens to the homeless and organized food supplies. But perception was stronger than fact. To the people, it seemed he had allowed the city to burn to make way for his grandest project yet. The Domus Aurea, the Golden House, covering vast swaths of central Rome. This palace was a monument not to Rome's greatness but to Nero's vanity. With gilded ceilings, halls studded with jewels, and an artificial lake, the palace was obscene in its luxury. At its entrance stood a colossal statue of Nero himself, cast in the image of a god. To a city still reeling from the fire, this was an unforgivable insult. Needing a scapegoat, Nero turned to a small and unpopular sect of Christians. They were already despised by many Romans for their refusal to honor the gods and for their secret gatherings. Nero accused them of starting the fire, and the persecution that followed was a horror unmatched. Christians were rounded up, tortured, and executed in gruesome spectacles. Some were torn apart by dogs, others crucified, and many were burned alive, their bodies serving as torches in Nero's gardens. The cruelty was so excessive that even non-Christians were horrified. And though it shifted blame away from Nero temporarily, it cemented his legacy as a tyrant. Yet Nero still believed himself adored. He journeyed to Greece to compete in artistic contests, where, unsurprisingly, he always won. He performed before crowds for hours, locking the doors so no one could leave until he had finished. Senators, generals, and foreign envoys were forced to sit through his endless recitations, clapping until their palms bled, some fainting from exhaustion but too afraid to move. Nero basked in the applause, convinced he was achieving immortality, not as an emperor, but as the world's greatest performer. Meanwhile, the empire began to crumble. Provinces grew restless, governors lost faith, and the army, the true backbone of Roman power, began to despise him. His neglect of state affairs meant corruption spread unchecked. Taxation grew unbearable as Nero squandered money on games, feasts, and palaces. Soldiers went unpaid while the emperor lavished gold on his performances. To the people, the emperor had become a parasite, draining Rome's strength for his vanity. Plots against him multiplied. In 65 AD, the Pisonian conspiracy sought to assassinate him and restored the Republic. Senators, equestrians, and even some of his guards were involved. The plot was discovered, and Nero unleashed a wave of executions. Among the dead were noblemen, poets, and his former tutor, Seneca, forced to open his veins and bleed to death. Seneca's calm suicide stood in sharp contrast to Nero's madness. Each conspiracy only deepened his paranoia. Each betrayal confirmed his belief that everyone was against him. The emperor withdrew further into excess. He took male lovers, dressed in women's clothing, and staged mock weddings. He had a young boy, Sporus, castrated and married him, presenting him as the reincarnation of Poppaea. The people whispered, laughed, and despised him, but none dared oppose him openly. For a time, it seemed Nero could indulge in any depravity and still remain untouchable. He was emperor, and emperor was God. But power is never absolute. In the provinces, discontent boiled over. In 68 AD, the governor of Gaul, Gaius Julius Vindex, declared rebellion, denouncing Nero as a disgrace to Rome. Though Vindex's revolt was crushed, it inspired others. In Spain, Galba, another governor, declared himself emperor. The legions began to shift their loyalty, not to Nero, but to his rivals. Most damning of all, the Praetorian Guard, his own protectors in Rome, were bribed into abandoning him. Once the guard defected, Nero's fate was sealed. An emperor without soldiers is no emperor at all. In Rome, chaos reigned. Senators who had once groveled before Nero now turned on him, declaring him a public enemy. For a Roman emperor, there was no greater humiliation. It meant he could be killed with impunity, stripped of dignity, hunted like a criminal. Nero, once master of the world, now found himself utterly alone. His friends fled, his servants abandoned him, and even the slaves who had once fawned over him now refused to help. As the Senate debated his execution, Nero fled the city with only a handful of loyal freedmen. He rode through the night, panicked and desperate, searching for a place to hide. Every mile brought news of his desertion, provinces declaring against him, soldiers swearing loyalty to Galba, and people cursing his name. Rome, the city he once believed adored him, now longed for his death. In a villa outside the city, Nero collapsed into despair. He begged his companions to kill him, but none had the courage. He wept, raged, and wailed, crying out that the world was losing a great artist, not a tyrant. The hoofbeats of approaching soldiers grew louder, the sound of doom. Finally, with no other choice, he pressed a dagger to his throat, but even then, he faltered. It was his secretary, Epaphroditus, who helped drive the blade home. With blood filling his lungs, Nero gasped his final words, Qualis, artifex perio, what an artist dies in me. The death of Nero was not the death of a hero or a statesman, but of a frightened performer whose stage had collapsed. His body was taken by a few loyal slaves and buried in a modest tomb. The Senate rejoiced, the people were divided, and the empire, stripped of a Julio-Claudian heir, plunged into civil war. Yet for years after, rumors persisted that Nero still lived, that he would return. Impostors arose in the East claiming to be the emperor, and some were even welcomed by crowds. Such was the bizarre legacy of a man both hated and strangely adored. Nero's reign, marked by extravagance, cruelty, and theatrical vanity, left scars on Rome that would linger for generations. His death, so pathetic and humiliating, was a fitting end for a man who had traded the dignity of an emperor for the applause of a stage. In the end, Nero did not die as Rome's ruler. He died as Rome's clown, a tragic figure whose obsession with art and indulgence destroyed him. The final months of Nero's reign unfolded like a slow-motion collapse of a man who had once held the world in his hands. The death of Agrippina had marked his transformation into a tyrant. But it was his endless need for adoration and his detachment from reality that sealed his fate. For years he had silenced his critics with executions, distracted the masses with spectacles, and convinced himself that his songs and performances made him beloved. Yet power built on fear and vanity is fragile, and by the late 60s AD, Nero stood on a crumbling stage, unable to see that the audience had already left. The first cracks came from the provinces. The empire Nero inherited stretched from Britain to Egypt, a vast territory that required loyalty from governors and discipline from legions. But loyalty was earned through respect, and discipline through pay and glory. Two things Nero had neglected. He poured gold into palaces, chariot races, and lyre competitions, while soldiers went unpaid, and generals were humiliated by being forced to cheer for his performances. In the provinces, resentment grew. In Gaul, Gaius Julius Vindex raised the first banner of rebellion, calling Nero unworthy of rule. Though his revolt failed, it sent a dangerous message. The emperor could be challenged. Soon, Galba in Spain joined the cause, declaring himself not a rebel, but a restorer of Roman virtue. One after another, the provinces shifted their allegiance, and suddenly, Nero was no longer the unquestioned master of the empire. In Rome, the Senate, long humiliated by Nero's excesses, began to stir. These were the same senators who had once bowed low, clapped furiously at his concerts, and praised his every word. But the moment they sensed weakness, they turned. The Praetorian Guard, Nero's personal protectors, were bribed into desertion. Soldiers who once saluted him now swore oaths to Galba. The Senate, which had endured his cruelty for over a decade, declared him a public enemy. It was the ultimate humiliation, stripping him not only of his title, but of his very identity as emperor. To be branded hostis publicus meant that anyone could kill him without punishment. Nero, once worshipped like a god, was now a fugitive. The news reached him in his palace, the Domus Aurea, where he had once dreamed of eternal glory. Now its gilded halls echoed with fear. He asked his attendants if there were troops still loyal. To him, none. He asked if Galba was approaching the city. Yes. He asked if there was any hope. Silence. For the first time, Nero's mask cracked. He who had sung before thousands, who had strutted across stages like a god, began to tremble like a child. His first thought was not of Rome or of the empire, but of performance. What an artist the world is about to lose, he cried. Even in despair, he imagined himself not as a ruler betrayed, but as a misunderstood genius who deserved applause, not abandonment. As panic set in, he tried to devise a way out. Some urged him to flee to Egypt, where he might raise support and live as a king among foreign lands. Others suggested he throw himself on the mercy of the Senate. But Nero feared humiliation more than death. He asked his attendants what kind of punishment awaited him. They told him he would be dragged naked through the streets, his head thrust into an iron collar, whipped before the jeering crowd, and finally, beaten to death in the forum. For an emperor who had lived his life as a spectacle, the idea of dying as a public spectacle of shame was unbearable. His voice broke as he whispered, "Is there no refuge, no hiding place?" He tried to summon courage. He asked for a dagger, promising he would kill himself before capture. But when the blade was brought, his hand shook too violently to use it. He begged his companions, freedmen, and slaves who had once been showered with his gifts, to strike the blow for him. They hesitated. Killing the emperor, even a disgraced one, was unthinkable. Some quietly slipped away, leaving him more alone. With every passing moment, only a few remained. Epaphroditus, his secretary, Finn, one of his freedmen, and a couple of servants who dared not abandon him yet. Through the night, Nero wandered the palace in a haze. He raged at fate, wept at his misfortune, and cursed those who betrayed him. He imagined the Senate debating his execution, mocking him, laughing at his downfall. He clung to scraps of hope, imagining a sudden reversal, an army marching to his rescue, the people flooding the streets in his defense. But when he looked out, the streets were silent. No crowd came. Rome, the city he thought adored him, had turned its back. As dawn approached, he fled the palace, dressed in ragged clothes, covering his head with a cloak. The Emperor of Rome, once draped in jewels and silk, now skulked through back roads like a thief. His destination was the villa of Finn, outside the city. The ride was frantic, every sound of hoofbeats behind them a terror. He imagined pursuers at every turn, soldiers ready to seize him, ropes and chains waiting. When they arrived at the villa, he stumbled inside, sweat pouring, his face pale with terror. Inside the villa, he collapsed onto a couch, exhausted, trembling, his eyes darting. He asked for a grave to be dug. He asked to be shown how to die. He asked for poison, but none was found. He asked for the dagger again, but could not bring himself to use it. Every moment dragged as news came closer. The Senate had condemned him. Soldiers were on their way. His companions urged him to act quickly, but Nero hesitated. He paced, muttered, and broke down. He clawed at his throat as if imagining the iron collar, groaned that he could not face the jeers of the crowd, and screamed, "What an artist dies! In me!" Finally, the hoofbeats came. The soldiers were near. Panic overcame him. He begged Epaphroditus, his secretary, to help. Epaphroditus steadied his hand, placed the blade against his throat, and together they pushed. The pain was sharp, the blood gushed, and Nero collapsed, choking on his own breath. The soldiers arrived just in time to see him dying. One tried to stop the bleeding, perhaps to preserve him for public humiliation, but it was too late. With a final gasp, Nero whispered his last words, half lament, half boast, "Qualis, artifex, perio." What an artist dies in me. So ended the reign of Nero, not with the thunder of armies or the glory of battle, but with the whimper of a frightened man in a lonely villa. His death was pathetic, stripped of dignity, haunted by cowardice. He had once been emperor of the world's greatest empire, yet he died as no more than a failed actor who could not bear to face the crowd's final judgment. His body was cremated quietly by a few loyal slaves, buried in the tomb of the Domitia Henobarbi, the family from which he came. No state funeral, no triumph, no glory. Just the end of a line that had ruled Rome since Augustus. And yet, even in death, Nero's shadow lingered. Rumors spread that he had not died at all, that he had escaped eastward, waiting for the day he would return. Impostors arose, men claiming to be Nero, and some were even welcomed by crowds who still longed for the wild energy he had brought. For all his cruelty, Nero had given Rome entertainment, and to some, the silence after his fall felt unbearable. It was said that for years after, people visited his grave secretly, leaving flowers, as if mourning, not the tyrant, but the artist, the singer, the showman who had once made Rome laugh, sing, and weep. Nero's death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The empire, leaderless, plunged into chaos, a year of civil war and rival claimants. Yet his story, the story of an emperor who lived for applause and died in disgrace, would echo for centuries. The name of Nero would forever be a byword for cruelty, excess, and vanity. But perhaps, in his own mind, he was not a monster, not a tyrant, but a misunderstood genius who only wanted to be loved. That tragic delusion followed him to the grave, where he died not as the ruler of Rome, but as the failed performer he had always been. When Nero's body was laid to rest in the tomb of the Domitia Henobarbi, the world did not sigh in relief as one might imagine, but rather plunged into a deeper chaos. His death had not simply removed a tyrant. It had decapitated the empire. For 14 years he had been emperor, and though his reign had been marked by fear and spectacle, his presence had provided a strange kind of stability. Now, with him gone, there was no clear successor. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, which had ruled Rome since Augustus, had ended. The empire suddenly faced a void, and into that void poured blood, ambition, and confusion. The Senate, which had condemned Nero as a public enemy, hoped that by endorsing Galba, the governor of Hispania, they had secured the future. Galba was old, austere, and utterly unlike Nero. Where Nero had sung and danced, Galba was stern and silent. Where Nero had lavished gifts, Galba demanded obedience without reward. For a brief moment, it seemed as if Rome might return to the values of its ancestors' discipline, order, and seriousness. But the empire was not the same as it had been in the days of the Republic. Soldiers expected payment and loyalty to be earned with generosity. When Galba refused to reward the Praetorian Guard who had betrayed Nero and declared himself their emperor, resentment boiled. He made enemies faster than allies. His brief reign showed that the empire could not simply move backward in time. Nero may have been a tyrant, but he had understood something crucial. The Roman people and the legions craved spectacle, rewards, and recognition. Galba gave them none of it, and in return, they gave him no loyalty. Thus began the infamous year of the 4 emperors. After Galba came Otho, a man who had once been close to Nero. Otho even styled himself after the fallen emperor, wearing his hairstyle and indulging in the pleasures Nero had loved. It was as if, in Nero's absence, Rome could not quite let go of him. But Otho's reign was short-lived. Vitellius, commander of the German legions, challenged him, and after a brief war, Otho chose to end his life rather than face defeat. Vitellius, too, fell quickly, his gluttony and indulgence making him despised. Finally, Vespasian, a general from the east, seized power, ending the chaos and founding a new dynasty, the Flavians. Yet throughout this bloody carousel of emperors, one thing remained constant: the shadow of Nero. Even as Galba, Otho, and Vespasian fought for Rome, rumors spread that Nero had not really died. Some claimed he had escaped to Parthia, others that he was in hiding, preparing to reclaim the throne. These rumors gave rise to what history calls the Nero redivivus legend, the belief that the emperor would return. It was not merely wishful thinking by those who had loved him. It was also fear among those who had hated him. For years, impostors appeared, men who looked vaguely like Nero or who sang with his style. One of these false Neros even gained the support of Parthia, Rome's greatest rival. That such impostors could attract followers shows how deep Nero's image had sunk into the psyche of Rome. This strange devotion was not without reason. To the senators, Nero was a monster. To historians writing after him, he was the very model of cruelty and decadence. But two parts of the common people: he had been a benefactor. He had staged games, races, and performances that entertained them endlessly. He had canceled some taxes, distributed grain, and in their eyes, lived closer to them than the distant, cold senators ever did. His willingness to step onto a stage and sing made him both ridiculous and endearing, and some in the crowd adored him for it. His palace, the Domus Aurea, though hated by the elite for its extravagance, impressed ordinary citizens who had never seen such grandeur. To them, the emperor was not a tyrant, but an artist emperor, a ruler who understood joy. This divide between elite hatred and popular admiration meant that his memory never faded, but lived on like a haunting melody in Rome's mind. Writers of later generations, especially Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, painted Nero in the darkest colors. They described his murders, his vanity, his cruelty, his fire, his obsession with performance. For them, Nero was not merely a bad emperor, but the embodiment of everything dangerous in autocracy. Yet one must remember that these writers were senators, men of the elite, who despised him for humiliating their class. The truth of Nero may have been more complex. He was indeed cruel, but no more so than many emperors before him. He was extravagant, but Rome itself demanded extravagance from its rulers. What truly made Nero infamous was that he blurred the line between emperor and performer, ruler and entertainer. To Rome's old guard, this was unforgivable. This legacy spread far beyond Rome. Early Christians saw him as the Antichrist, the beast. Of the book of Revelation, the persecutions he unleashed against them left scars that became eternal. His name became a symbol of evil, whispered in sermons, carried across generations. To them, Nero was not merely a tyrant of history, but a cosmic villain, an embodiment of Satan's power on earth. This religious association ensured that even centuries after his death, Nero's name would be remembered in fear and hatred. But there were other, stranger legacies. Artists, poets, and later rulers found in Nero both fascination and warning. Some admired his artistic ambition, his refusal to be bound by the cold traditions of power. Others saw in him the ultimate cautionary tale of ego unchecked. Even centuries later, Nero was staged in plays, written about in poetry, depicted in art as both monster and tragic figure. His cry, "What an artist dies in me," became a line quoted and remembered long after his empire was gone. And yet, behind all this, one fact remains inescapable. His death was pathetic. Not a grand duel, not a heroic last stand, but a frightened man, begging others to help him die, muttering about his art as the empire he ruled crumbled. That image stuck in Rome's memory, both pitiful and horrifying. To some, it proved that no matter how powerful a man may seem, he is still mortal, still fragile, still vulnerable to fear. To others, it was proof that Nero had never been a true emperor, only an actor who had accidentally worn a crown. The world Nero left behind bore his scars. Rome, shaken by the year of civil war, would never again trust so fully in the Julio-Claudian line. The Flavians built their legitimacy on being the opposite of Nero: practical, military, and restrained. Vespasian even began construction on the Colosseum on the site of Nero's Domus Aurea, a symbolic act of giving back to the people what Nero had stolen. The Flavian Amphitheater, as it was then called, was Rome's way of erasing Nero's golden palace and replacing it with a monument of shared entertainment, not imperial indulgence. In a way, Nero himself had inspired it. His obsession with spectacle taught Rome that emperors had to give the people something to watch. But the Flavians redirected that energy into state-controlled games rather than personal vanity. For centuries, after, Nero's name lingered. Some Romans swore they had seen him in distant lands. Others believed his ghost haunted the theater. In the Middle Ages, he became a figure of myth, twisted further into the embodiment of sin. In Christian Europe, he was the persecutor of saints, the enemy of the faith, the tyrant who burned Rome and laughed while it fell. His image, whether real or exaggerated, grew larger than life. And yet, even with all this hatred, one cannot ignore the paradox. He was remembered. So many emperors ruled Rome, some cruel, some competent, some forgotten. But Nero, though despised, was never forgotten. His name carried through time, echoing like the songs he once sang. He wanted immortality through art, and though not in the way he imagined, he achieved it. His reign was not immortalized for beauty, but for infamy. Not for genius, but for madness. Yet in history, infamy can be as powerful as glory. In the end, the story of Nero is the story of how power and vanity consume one another. He believed himself to be more than an emperor. He believed himself an artist chosen by the gods. But art requires truth, and power requires responsibility. Nero embraced neither. He lived for applause and died in disgrace, leaving behind a Rome that remembered him not for greatness, but for spectacle. And perhaps that was his greatest tragedy, that in chasing eternal fame, he found only eternal infamy. For the people of Rome who had once cheered his performances, Nero's death was not the end of their emperor, but the beginning of a legend. For the Senate, it was the bitter victory of survival. For the Christians, it was the fall of a monster. For history, it was a story too strange, too pathetic, and too haunting to forget. His empire ended, his dynasty ended, his life ended, but his name lived on. Nero, Rome's artist, Rome's tyrant, Rome's shame.